Area 64 Infinite Staircase. Hello interwebs, welcome to my review of the latest episode of the Orville New Horizons, this time Season 3, Episode 3, The Mortality Paradox. Obviously, just getting out of the way, as with the last episode's review, I am not going to be appearing on camera because my face still looks like a giant pufferfish, so this is what you're getting. Honestly, there's a part of me that kind of wishes to show you my face just to show you how freaking puffed up it is. It's kind of ridiculous at this point, but nah, I'm gonna be vain. It's all good. Anyways, let's talk about this episode. And by the way, I'm gonna go full into spoilers here, so if you haven't seen the episode yet, you probably should step off the ship at this point, because I'm gonna go full into it. So after last week's kind of more run-of-the-mill Monster of the Week episode, I was really hoping that this week's episode would kind of return to the, at least, complexity of the season premiere. And I know a lot of you out there, and I understand completely given the subject matter of the season premiere, found that episode to be, at the very least, problematic. But I think it was probably, at the very least, compared to last episode, a much more complicated episode. So I was kind of at least hoping that we would return to something with much more meat on the bones than last week's episode had. But to be quite frank with you, this week's episode honestly felt even lighter than last week's episode, because after about the first 20-30 minutes of the episode, they kind of got into a repetitious pattern of like, all right, and then we're going to do this again, and then we're going to do this again, and it never really added all that much to the story, to the point where I really felt the pacing problems with this one and felt incredibly bored. This show in this season so far has had a really bad pacing problem, and I think it partially stems from the fact that they're trying to fit a normal TNG style episode into a full, more modern style hour-long streaming fit. And it doesn't really work for me. I mean, the fact that it took us about, 15 minutes to get to the planet with the crew and sort of start exploring what was going on, and then sort of just repeating the same beats kind of over and over again, partially what contributes to that pacing problem. So I think right up front, pacing is the biggest issue here. But let's actually start talking about the nitty-gritty of the episode. I did really like seeing Tala come back on the ship and sort of like, oh, I was back with my parents, and she has this dense chocolate that she's passing around. It felt very familiar. I like those moments on any type of Star Trek or Star Trek-alike show where I get to see characters just existing and just kind of having an everyday experience. I'm thinking of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, I think, second episode of its recent season, Children of the Comet, where they got to see like a dinner in Pike's quarters, and this kind of reminded me of that. And so I like those little small moments. Obviously, it doesn't turn out to be completely what it seems to be on the surface, given what we see at the end of the episode with Tala, but I still like these kind of moments. But then we find out that there is a planet, Neuron 1, that they're finding some signals from, and the crew can scan and find some cities on there. I did also find it funny that I think one of the crew members said, like, Neuron 1, that's always been a desolate rock. And I'm like, why do characters in Star Trek and sci-fi shows always know the names of desolate rocks? Like, oh yeah, blah, 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 4. That's a desolate rock. It was just sort of like, why does everyone always know that? I wouldn't memorize the name of desolate rocks all around space, because I feel like there's probably a lot of them. Anyways, not a big deal. But then once the crew gets onto the planet, we start to enter this mystery that I was initially intrigued by, but ultimately kind of got bored with as we kept going, once I realized that the mystery of each setting that we were finding ourselves in wasn't really contributing to the larger mystery that was going on of where the crew was and what was happening on this planet. Kind of giving you an example, like the first one, where we're in Oakwood, where we're at this high school that these characters are walking around. I was initially intrigued, being like, why are all these kids here? Why do they not seem to care that there's aliens or humans walking around? Why are they unable to escape the school? Like, even if you have the strongest person in your party punching the door, why are kids beating up Gordon, saying that Randall's going to get them, that he needs to pay them money? Like, I was intrigued, but like all that mystery was kind of cool, and I liked seeing it being built up. But all that it led to was an admittedly kind of funny moment where the crew goes outside to confront Randall, and it turns out to be this giant orc monster fantasy beast. And I did get a chuckle out of me. He was like, okay, that was random. But then I realized, like, okay, there was no grander mystery here, because they escape and then suddenly they're on a plane. And I was like, okay, so all of that high school setting was just weirdness for weirdness sake. It didn't add anything, didn't contribute anything. It was just weird to be weird. And then we go through all of these different scenarios, like the plane crashing, going to see the Mocklin funeral ceremony, going to this strange beach where they get attacked by a sea monster, the infinite staircase. Each one of these sections had moments of being mildly interesting, but they didn't add anything to the characters. Like, maybe we learn a little bit more about Mocklin society, like a little piece of it in the funeral home, but we didn't add anything. Like, we didn't learn anything about the characters. Nothing happened. It was just random weirdness for random weirdness' sake, and it was doing the same thing over and over again. Each character thought that they were going to die at a different moment. There was no clever interactions. There was no clever sort of story beats. It was just going through these motions, and I was honestly rather bored. It was honestly kind of frustrating structurally, because I don't know what the writers of the episode were thinking when they're just like, all right, we'll just have these characters go through and do the same beat over and over and over again, just with a slightly different character. And that's the mystery. And you're not going to have anything, take any of this time to add anything to it. I was frankly very disappointed. And then the only sort of interesting bit that I got out of this was towards the end of the episode, where the crew thinks that they finally got back to their ship, and like, okay, we got back, we're on the ship, and then suddenly they learn, like, okay, this might be the Kalons, they can mess with our reality, there's this big deal. Like, okay, that's interesting. It took us a long time to get here, but I like this idea that the Kalons can mess with reality. That could be a really interesting setup for later on down the season. And I did like that Isaac was the one that sort of said, when they were about to meet up with the Union ships, like, no, those are Kalon vessels, and it called into question, like, is he telling the truth or not? These were interesting moments that start to ask questions about our characters, using the situation to be like, do we still trust Isaac? Do we trust him enough to attack our own ships, possibly? Like, that is an intriguing question that this situation was used for. Took a long time to get us there, but we did get it. And then we have the crew and going through this great fight. It was kind of interesting to see. And then the frozen, once they were about to die and everything froze, and the revelation was that they were still on the planet, came to them. I thought all of that was decently well handled. Took 40 minutes too long, but we finally had something interesting. Then we got the reveal that from this woman in a Tron-esque suit, she looks like she stepped right out of Tron, Denal, revealing that this was all a sort of experiment from an alien species that we met, I think back in season 1, that formed a religion around Kelly, which it was nice to see a recurring element from a previous season come back up, because you don't really see that all that often. But then it's just revealed, like, oh yeah, we are immortal, so we wanted to experience ourselves dying. And I was like, okay, is there anything more to that, other than you being really fucked up and messed up and making people think they're gonna die to get your own existential rocks off, as Ed put it. And I'm honestly even like, I know the characters push back against it and say, like, oh yeah, this was messed up, but honestly I would have been more pissed off. Like, you made me think I was going to die. That is intensely traumatizing. Like, all of these characters, I'm sure, will have to go to some form of therapy at some point, because they thought that they were going to die, and that's gonna mess you up. But the characters were just like, yeah, I'm bothered by that. We're not too bothered, I guess. I'm just going to be like, well, all right, cool. And then we get a moment at the end with Ed at the end of the episode being kind of like, oh, yeah, this is an existential question. Like, I cannot really fathom our mortality. And I was like, cool. I'm going to be quite frank with all of you. This was a disappointing episode. I was kind of bored. I don't feel like the structure went and said anything interesting about our characters. It did anything interesting with our characters. There are a couple moments of things being interesting, such as the beast coming up being rather random, and the questioning of trusting Isaac and the possible manipulation that Kalons can manipulate reality, which turns out not to be the case. But ultimately, it just goes to a kind of blah resolution and blah episode. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound disappointed. I liked last episode well enough, and the premiere I thought was really impressive to my mind, if at least a little bit problematic in interesting ways. I'll always take something interesting rather than something that's boring, and I'll be frank, this was a boring one. Sadly, that is my review of the episode of the Orville New Horizons Mortality Paradox. Maybe I'm just the crazy one. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. If you think you liked it better, I would really love to hear that. I'm not here to poo-poo anyone's opinions or thoughts on episode, so I'd really love to hear if you love this episode and why. Like, please let me know down in the comments below. But beyond all that, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you, as always, oh please, before I forget, check out my review for Star Trek Strange New Worlds this week, because compared to this week's episode of Strange New Worlds might be one of my favorite episodes of that show, if not one of my favorite episodes of modern Star Trek, if not one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek, period. I loved this week's episode, so please go check out that review because I was just gushing about how much I love that episode. Anyways, love all of you. I hope you're all taking care of yourselves and have a wonderful evening and live long and prosper.